Watercolor would not really be very good for a lot of these fishes. Number one, it's kind of has a flat look to it. Colored pencil, if you burnish it and take all the grain out of the paper, it's kind of shiny and smooth like a fish is. But the smaller scales on some of the fish, like the dace and all the trout, these tiny scales are too small really to do with watercolor unless you do them at a huge size. Up for a brook trout, I'd probably have to do that thing at 3 feet long to put all the scales in.
Hey there, podcast aquanauts. It's your host, Casey here. In last week's episode, we talked about the work of the aquarium's amazing in-house graphic designers and illustrators. To keep with the theme of this impromptu mini-series, this week's episode once again highlights the intersection of art and science by focusing on scientific illustration. Assuming you've heard of it at all, you may think of this as a relic, the stuff of leather-bound journals created by pre-industrial naturalists like John James Audubon, Ernst Haeckel, or Henry Walter Bates. Or perhaps you're only aware of this detail-focused artistic subgenre through the naturalistic sketchings in the notebooks of Leonardo da Vinci. Nevertheless, scientific illustration is still alive and well in the 2020s, and it continues to be of more use to researchers than you might think, even in the digital age. Selfishly, I find this approach to documenting the natural world endlessly fascinating, so I was excited to be joined for this week's episode by world-renowned freshwater fish scientific illustrator Joe Tomelleri. In the discussion you're about to hear, we'll learn more about how Tomelleri became interested in creating down-to-the-scale exacting illustrations of darters and trout, his many adventures with the aquarium's own scientist-in-residence, Dr. Bernie "Binky" Kahida, and why he thinks scientific illustration is still of value. This one was a fun topic and a good chat, and I promise I won't be at all offended if you're inspired to doodle in the margins while you listen. Now, on with the podcast. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Podcast Aquatic, the official podcast of the Tennessee Aquarium. Today I want to have a conversation about the intersection of art and science. And when I asked some of my friends out at the Tennessee Aquarium Conservation Institute for suggestions of who I could potentially reach out to, who would be able to talk about the craft, the art, the craft, we'll cover that, of scientific illustration, one name came up, which is Joe Tomelleri. He is widely considered to be one of the preeminent scientific illustrators, specifically of freshwater fish in North America. And we have Joe here on the show today. Joe, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
That's my pleasure.
And to round out the conversation and making what it feels like his 97th appearance on the show is Dr. Bernie Kahida, who has a pretty long running history with Joe and can speak to, hopefully, how scientists make use of scientific illustration. So, Bernie, thank you yet again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us on the show.
Hey, it's always fun with you, Casey.
So it's Binky's 97th appearance. That's once per year.
It is we're only in our second year of the show, so that tells you how often he's been on. But how do you all know each other? So I have to know about Binky. I've been told that it's a long story, but I need to know why you call Bernie Binky.
That is a nickname that goes back to my childhood, and only very special friends call me that. You have to be in the club.
Okay, so I can't call you that yet then.
Nope, you're not there yet.
Oh, man. I'm close, though?
Close.
Okay. All right. So, but anyway, how did the two of you know each other? When did your paths first cross, and how have you worked together in the time since you first met?
Alabama. Right, Joe?
Fishes of Alabama with Rick Maiden and Herb Beauchamp. And Binky was the kind of the driving force behind getting out in the field and knowing where the different fish were, because we collected almost every fish that was native to Alabama to use for illustration.
That's a lot.
And that would have been, 1991 maybe, when I started on that project?
That's when we started, and I think through 93 or 94. And then we continued taking photos and sending you specimens to illustrate past then for the handful of fishes that we had to get out of state because they're so rare or gone from Alabama.
So just for clarity, this is a field guide, or what is this?
It's a full-fledged hardback state fish book that has maps in it for each species, and just pretty detailed descriptions of the fish, the habitat, those sorts of things. And it's what, gosh, Binky, I don't know how many pages that is, but it weighs about 10 pounds.
736. I have it on my desk here.
So that's 34 years ago, which feels like a hurtful thing to say and makes me feel pretty old. How often have you continued to work together? I mean, I'm assuming that you still collaborate some on projects.
Well, we started working on the Mexican trout in 1997 with Binky and Rick Maiden and Dean Hendrickson. We all went down to Mexico, and we've been down there probably about 10 or 11 times since then, and working on that project, which there's still work left to be done. It's so difficult to get around down there.
And the last time we were down there together was 2016, 9 years ago. Um, the, Unfortunately, the drug trafficking and violence around that ebbs and flows. And so we have to pick our times to go down there when it's quote unquote safe. Because if you look at a map of where all these undescribed Mexican trout up in the Sierra Madre Occidentals are, and where all the marijuana is grown in Mexico, they overlie each other very well.
Who said that the life of a fish biologist couldn't be exciting?
But now, all that being said, Mexico is really a wonderful place, and we haven't had very much trouble. Although, you get warnings once in a while, don't go here, or you meet up with the military or other people that have guns. But for the most part, it's really been a fantastic experience.
It has been some of the highlights of my professional career, trouncing around in Mexico with Joe and everybody else. Yes.
All right, before I let this go too far without actually covering the root of the conversation, what exactly is scientific illustration? So for people who are listening to this, I guess you can kind of understand from context maybe what it is, but what makes this distinct or different from maybe regular illustration or other artistic media, Joe?
Well, a scientific illustration has to incorporate everything in the animal that is diagnostic to a scientist, and that can be color. Although a lot of the older scientific illustrations were black and white, but for me, it's color, and in fish, it's the number of scales. They need to be accurate. Now, they I'm not going to count every single scale on a brook trout, which would, be somewhere north of probably 15,000. But you're going to have the correct number of scales in the lateral line, and then the correct number of scales above. But there are imperfections in there in the rows that I don't feel compelled to include in the drawing because they'd be different in every fish. But then you've got fin rays that the counts need to be correct on those because those are diagnostic, along with the proportions of the fish. And so it helps, and it's generally best to do the illustration from one specimen from a particular location because, in the future, that fish from that location may get split out and become, scientists may decide, well, that fish in this drainage is now different than these ones over here in Mississippi that we called the same thing. And so if we know where my specimen came from, then then we can assign it or change the name if it needs to be on down the road. And that happens all the time. I was talking to Binky about that just this week about some fish that got named, and we know where my drawings came from, so I can ascribe the appropriate name to those. But that would be also for crayfish or turtles or anything. They have to have the correct number of scutes, and of course the proportions and color are going to be important also.
Now, you specifically work and are best known for freshwater fish. And looking at your website, AmericanFishes.com, that seems to be what's available for purchase. Do you do scientific illustration of other taxa, or is it all? Are you exclusively an illustrator of freshwater fishes?
Well, I've done quite a few saltwater fishes, some for Alabama, and then some for quite a few for the fishes of the Salish Sea and Puget Sound. And I've done some crayfish, turtles, and an insect or two. But really, fish are what I love to do. I don't like crayfish; they're hard.
What makes them hard?
Well, if you want to get right down to it, all the little hairs they have, and the crayfish claws have all these different indentations and bumps, and the legs, have a certain number of segments that they have to have, and I guess particularly there's not a lot of use for crayfish drawings. So when I do one, it's not likely that I'm going to get more business from it. But with fish, time and time again, it's some of my more common fish like largemouth bass or rainbow have been reproduced probably 400 or 500 times. And because I own the copyright, then I could get paid or should get paid anyway for each time that those pictures are reproduced.
Bernie, from your perspective as a freshwater scientist, who works with obviously freshwater fish, how useful is it to have somebody like Joe doing this work, and how useful are these scientific illustrations to the research that you're doing and helping to have that research be understandable or digestible to the layperson once you're published?
You nailed it right there. A lot of scientists still feel that they need a photograph of the fish. And quite often they'll cut out the background and it just looks horrible. It really does. There's no aesthetic quality at all. It's like a poor sticker was just slapped on the publication. And then quite often you really do need a photo of a fish that maybe was preserved 100 years ago, because that is the type specimen that the species is based upon. But you need something that non-taxonomic scientists can connect to. And some of Joe's work, all of Joe's work, it's scientifically accurate. It's from one specimen, just like the photo is. But it's gorgeous. It's a work of art. And it just brings the publication to life. So much more than a photograph. Now, there are some photographs that are halfway decent, but all of Joe's illustrations are great. And, it just harkens back to the 1800s, early 1900s, and all these naturalists did these wonderful works that got published. You think of Audubon, right off the top of the head. And it's just sort of like Joe capturing all of those bird illustrations and paintings and drawings that have been famous for over a century, except he's looking at the little warblers that we've got under the surface of the water, darters, for instance. It's pretty cool.
In terms of scientific illustration, that has come up before in the podcast when we did an episode with our curator of forests, Kevin, talking about birding. He was talking about, in a day and age when we've got these really powerful, really fairly easy to use digital cameras, and everyone has a smartphone in their pocket that's a very capable camera, there might be the question of, why are we continuing to use these illustrations like yours, Joe, or like the ones that are in some of these field guides, even modern field guides. And what Kevin said, and what immediately made it make sense to me, was that by doing what you're doing, Joe, and capturing all of those details as accurately as possible, you're creating basically the perfect specimen. You're showing an animal with all of its identifying features to make it as easy as possible. In the case of birding, at least, it makes it as easy as possible for someone who has that field guide to identify that bird, because it is like the perfect bird, and no photograph is going to be of the perfect bird. There are going to be individual differences, I guess, that make some of those distinguishing features. Maybe you'll see some of them, but not all of them. So you're basically creating the perfect example of this animal. Would you say that that's accurate in terms of the fishes that you're illustrating?
Yeah, hopefully. But yeah, and a lot of times that's why you have to do male, female, juvenile also, because a male is good for identifying a male, but it may not help you much, especially a layperson, to do a female. But for example, David Allen's Sibley that does the bird illustrations, and he'll do oftentimes more than one illustration of a particular species because they will vary a little bit. And so I admire his work and the Petersons, of course, and of course Audubon. And what Audubon did was more difficult than what I do because he's putting a background in the pictures, and he didn't have the benefit of color photographs, and he also had to go out and collect his specimens, but he didn't have Binky helping him. Because without Binky and without a lot of other scientists, maybe they're work for the National Park Service, or maybe they're with the Fish and Game or the Bureau of Land Management that help that know where the fish are, know where to go, and would take me out there to those spots to collect the fish, whether it's hook and line or sometimes electroshocking or seining is a pretty good way to collect a lot of times. And all those people go into an illustration, and even the people that help preserve the fish and in formalin and transfer to ethanol, and so it's really a team effort. Because am I going to do the fishes of Alabama by myself if I have to go out and collect 300 specimens? No, it's not going to happen. So it is really a group effort.
It's funny that you mentioned the male and female and juvenile, because one thing that was introduced to me, and maybe would be new to people who are listening to this podcast who aren't as versed in freshwater fishes as somebody like Bernie is how seasonality can really dramatically impact what some of these fish look like. Some of those darters and shiners that we have on display here at the aquarium in our Register Rivers gallery, and that we've seen out in the field with you, Bernie, at different times of year, they can look absolutely just stunningly beautiful, but completely different than what they look like, 2 months on either end of that period. So do you ever go back and do illustrations specifically of breeding colors for any of these species, or do you mostly look at what they look like for the majority of the year rather than prioritize that change in appearance that only happens when they're mating?
That interesting. Binky will remember Herb Beauchamp saying that we don't necessarily need the brightest, most beautiful fish. We need one that is characteristic or more commonly seen. So, but there is a bias maybe toward, hey, I like this one better because it has more color. Oh, but there have been a couple instances I know, and particularly I'm thinking of the tri-spot darter that we collected in I think northern Alabama, and then which was a pretty fish as it was, and then Binky later, sometime down the line, got hold of one that was so fired up, incredibly colored. It was unbelievable. And he sent me the picture. He goes, "You need to draw this."
And
And
that was in
I don't, if I'm not
Ballplate
mistaken,
Creek,
you
just
had
outside
never
of
seen
Gadsden.
one like that.
No, it normally tri-spot darters, they have blue patches along the side, and they've got a saddle over their back that is dark brown or black. This guy, he was so fired up, the blue extended up over the back. He had two saddles that were bright blue. I've never seen a tri-spot darter with those colors. So it was the best of the best, and Joe drew it, and it is truly amazing.
And part of that is luck. I mean, and I know, like with the Carmine darter here that I've seen, if you don't get them right on the spawning bed, you're going to miss what their full spawning color is. It's just so some of it just is like, uh, hit and miss.
Carmine Shiner, right?
Yeah.
You said darter. Details, details.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Leave it to Bernie for that to be like a
There's
mortal
probably a
sin.
Carmine Shiner out there.
A darter. Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll describe a carmine darter just for you, Joe.
it's funny those moments though when those fish are really fired up here in our department in the comms department at the aquarium. It feels like we're constantly fighting this battle, and maybe just in general, anybody who works with freshwater fish kind of fights this battle. But there's this perception among the public, I think, that all the color is reserved for the ocean, that only the reef fishes have this beautiful color, and one of the greatest eye-opening experiences I had going out with Bernie and I think the other scientists out at the Conservation Institute was seeing some of these animals at that full breeding coloration, seeing saffron shiners and Tennessee dace, and the vermilion darter we saw outside of Birmingham, Bernie, and seeing them really fired up just completely shows how misguided or how big of a misconception that is. That boy, at certain times of years, they look like little underwater fireworks. They're just incredible. And I think having that moment captured in a drawing like something that you've done, Joe, really it would open a lot of people's eyes and make them appreciate these fish that otherwise they kind of assume to be just brown or gray or silver, and really they're just not, at least at certain times of year.
Yeah, and a lot of the work and probably the harder work is doing minnows and species of minnows that are nondescript, that are all silver, and that's really probably more of the more use maybe to some scientists because they're difficult to tell apart. And it might be, hey, they've got 38 scales in the lateral line generally, or more than 38, or they have less than, say, 36, or they have eight anal fin rays as opposed to seven, and they're just maybe more just silvery in color because there's many that are like that. And there are some scientists that have what you might call fish eyes that can recognize the different species. And Alabama is particularly difficult because there's a lot of these Natropus down there, and at times non-spawning Cyprinella minnows that to the average person would all look the same, but there might be 20, 25 of those species in Alabama.
Joe, it's the expression on the face is the way you do it. Some are scared, some are surprised, some are angry, and that really helps.
Thank you. I'll use that next time I'm in the field.
The Tennessee Aquarium's podcast Aquatic is made possible by support from the Tennessee Conservationist, the official magazine of Tennessee state parks. Each issue is filled with fascinating stories about Tennessee's native species, rich history, and unique culture. It's also your guide to exploring state parks and planning your next outdoor adventure. Subscribe today at tnconservationist.org. So, Joe, I should probably go back a little bit and discuss, how you got into this. So, what are your origins as an artist? And you're throwing a lot of these scientific names around. Do you have a background in science, or have you just sort of absorbed that over the course of 40 years of doing this work?
Both. I have a master's degree in biology, and mostly that was with an emphasis in range management. And I went to school in Western Kansas at Fort Hays State University. And when I was a graduate student, some of the other graduate students and I did a local interest book of the fish that occurred in the creek that went through campus. And I had no intention of illustrating that book and had not done any scientific illustration at that time, but had just dabbled with watercolor and acrylic on occasion. My aunt had taught me how to use those years ago. But one of the fellows, one of the grad students, was going to photograph the fish, and the university said, "Hey, we'll publish the color photographs in the book." And of course, this is like 1985, maybe, before digital photography. And he just came in one day and he said, "These fish are too hard." He said, "I can't do it. It's too hard to photograph them to get, to get any degree of detail that we really want." And I said, "Well, I'll just draw them." And some of them I did in black and white and some in color, but most of those were done from photographs. And later, pretty quickly on, I learned I need to use the actual fish to do the illustrations. So anything that I'd done since then, I would use a specimen for. With maybe there's a few rare exceptions because nobody has a specimen of a whale shark that of an adult anyway, or some of the other big sharks. Um, and and occasionally you come across something that's so rare you have to use a museum specimen. Maybe you can collect it and get color photos, but you can't keep that same specimen to draw because it's endangered or threatened, or you just don't want to kill a nice gravid female, perhaps, of a salmon, those sorts of things. But so that was how I got started, and I thought after I finished those pictures and we published that book, I thought it would be cool to do just as a hobby all the fish that occurred, all the game fishes that occurred in Kansas. So I did that on my own just for fun, and I approached the back in about 87, I think it was. I approached the University Press of Kansas if they would be interested in doing a book on the fishes of Kansas, game fishes. And as luck would have it, they had just had a meeting on how they wanted to publish more natural history books. Because generally, if you approach a publisher, they're, yeah, yeah, we're busy, son. We'll talk to you later. But he said, come up, talk. And he did. And he said, let's expand it to include the central United States, like most of the Mississippi drainage, and we'll have a bigger market. I said, okay. And that was one break. And then I got some published in a magazine through a friend, in Fisherman Magazine. And there were a lot of magazines publishing art at that time because of the digital revolution. It made color cheaper to reproduce. And in Fisherman started using my work, and other magazines saw it and they started using it. And that was pretty much how things got started.
Wow. There is a documentary by, I think, done by the students of Fort Hayes University,
Oh,
that was
yeah. Mhm.
that I will link to in the show notes. I actually watched it in preparing for this conversation, and it does show some of those drawings that you mentioned from that guide to the creek, the fish that were in that creek, and it's fascinating that you say you just expand it to the Mississippi River drainage, all the species of the Mississippi River drainage. That just feels like it exponentially increases the amount of work you do. Did you have any trepidation about tackling a project that big, or did you
No,
just?
no, because we weren't doing all the minnows. We were doing just a sampling of them. And to add those areas, maybe we had to do 25, I had to do 25 or 30 more game fishes. Uh, and so we were talking about maybe half again as much work as I had already done. So that seemed reasonable.
Well, and you mentioned acrylics and watercolor being something that you had worked in before, but I think now you're mostly working pretty exclusively with colored pencil. Is that right?
Right. I had not used much in the way of colored pencil prior to trying these drawings, and a fella at a at an art store, at Colt Snow's art store, in fact, in Kansas City. I went into him and told him what I was trying to do, and he said, you need to use this kind of board. And he said, if I was you, I'd use colored pencil. And colored pencils is a very slow medium. slow to work, not like watercolor, which is very fast. But boy, with watercolor, you better know what you're doing the first time you put it down. And watercolor would not really be very good for a lot of these fishes. Number one, it's kind of has a flat look to it. Colored pencil, if you burnish it and take all the grain out of the paper, it's kind of shiny and smooth like a fish is. But the smaller scales on some of the fish, like the dace and all the trout, these tiny scales are too small really to do with watercolor unless you do them at a huge size. Up for a brook trout, I'd probably have to do that thing at 3 feet long to put all the scales in watercolor. But with colored pencil, once you get the base down and get the color down of the fish, with the tiny scales, I can scrape away each scale with an X-Acto blade. So if I have a little watercolor wash underneath the color pencil, it will show when I scrape away the background color of the fish, the back of the fish. It will show that little bitty the color from the watercolor showing through, sort of like a reflection of the scale. And that really works well. And an X-Acto blade, you can get really fine with it. And so the fish, a trout generally doesn't need to be larger than drawing than 13 or 14 inches because of that technique. And that technique would be called takeaway.
People would probably want to know how much time you're spending on these drawings. So you're talking about, 13 to 14 inches, that's still a fairly large drawing if you're talking about minute detail like that. So how many hours would you say it goes into each of these drawings? I'm sure there's a range, but what's a typical time for you to complete one of your drawings?
A smaller scaled trout is probably going to take 60 hours maybe, plus the time to collect the fish and preserve it and do all that. That's usually Binky's job. But at least Binky knows how to work from specimens that Binky has prepared is a dream, really.
Yeah, Bernie, talk about the involvement you have in this process. So, what role do you play in making and facilitating Joe's work? I guess what are you doing, and how are you helping him?
So first of all, you want to capture the real color essence of the fish. And to do that, you just can't take a photo in a little glass aquarium. You just can't take a photo in your hand. You also have to put white pieces of paper behind each fin because especially for the fins, like the pectoral fins that lay up against the body, you're not going to get the color of that fin. You're going to get the color of the fin and the color of the body under the fin. So you have to put that white paper there, take a picture, put it under all the fins so you get the true color of the fin. You get the pictures at different angles, and you don't want to be in full sunlight. You want to be in full shade. You don't want the fish just totally too dark or totally washed out from too much sun. And then you ideally also want to get some of him in a little aquarium tank because they're going to look different in water than they're going to look in your hand. So you take all these quote unquote Joe photos of the fish, and then you preserve the specimen in a way that it is straight and the fins are not all smushed up. And you just have to be careful how you preserve it. And you have to lay the jar on the side. Sometimes you have to put the fish in a pan. Once you've euthanized it with formalin, then you use forceps to pull the fins out, and then they stay out away from the body like they would in a live fish. So there is a little bit of extra time that you taking photos and preparing a specimen for Joe Tomelleri than you would a regular museum specimen that would go into a natural history museum.
That's way more involved than I realized it was going to be. I didn't realize that you were doing a whole package that you had to send him.
Yes.
Yeah, let me make a note. And Binky's right. And let me say that Binky does fantastic specimens, but generally stuff, if you're working from a museum specimen that somebody collected years ago that's now so rare you can't find it, so you work generally they're like crap. And the fins aren't extended and the body's warped and the washed out, and it's not good. But I would also note that if you're using like some fish that are silvery or light colored, if you're wearing if I'm wearing a bright pink hat or a yellow shirt, those colors are reflected off the fish. And if you don't know that you were wearing that, your picture's going to be wrong. And Binky's right. It depends, and it depends on the clarity of the water. Is the water muddy? Because that's going to affect the color of the fish. And you want to take the photograph generally as soon as you catch the fish, because if you put them in a bucket, especially a white bucket, and put it aside, well, when you go back to get that fish, it's not the same color anymore.
That's why we use black buckets. We use black buckets because it brings the color out.
Or we like to use sometimes a clear plastic bag and set that fish back in the creek in that bag, and they'll hold their color generally.
How long does it take to train up a scientist to be a good illustration assistant, Joe? Because it seems like it's a pretty involved process.
I would say probably the first 100 illustrations I did, I'm not very proud of. And because you get better, and there's no shame in getting better at what you do. It just takes, and it takes, did it take 10,000 hours like you hear? Maybe not quite that much, but a part of the ability is not anything I did. There's something about hand-eye coordination that a lot of illustrators have, and a lot of artists, that I can't explain it. But you can fine tune it. And the illustrations I do now, if I'm doing a rainbow trout, takes longer actually than the rainbow trout I would have done 30 years ago. And I like to think it's because I can pay better attention to the detail, and I'm a little less pressed for time, and I know better, how the fin should spread, because a fin on a preserved fish is, no matter what you do with it, it's different look than it is in a live fish.
What about teaching Bernie or somebody like Bernie to be a good assistant for you? Does that take time? I mean, you've worked together for a long time. Was he good at this immediately, or did you have to teach him the ways of being a good illustration assistant?
He already knew what he was doing, and he's as good. There's only 2 or 3 people I would prefer to be out in the field with to do this, and Binky's at the top of the list.
Well, Joe and I just have a lot of fun, and we just enjoy being outdoors in the aquatic environments. We've had so much fun, and done a lot professionally together. But it's just really, he's a great guy, and he's wonderful to work with.
Well, you do like to play in streams. You have said that on numerous occasions to me. So having somebody to play in streams with must be pretty rewarding.
It is.
And Binky also, let me make this point. Binky's a great navigator and a good driver, and he always is driving the rig when you're going out collecting. And he's saved me on more than one occasion because I would get lost or looking at the map or what have you. But I will say that, and Binky knows this, he just won't admit it, that he left me and Dean stranded because he thought we were in one place on the map, and Dean and I in Mexico figured we were in another place, And Binky went back to get the vehicle and said, "Don't move." Well, we had to move because we weren't where we thought we were. Right, Binky?
Wrong, 100% wrong. I say stay where you are. I got exactly back to that spot, and you two had wandered off doing something, and it took hours to find you. You're a loser in that instance, Joe.
Joe, how many illustrations have you done to this point? Do you keep track of the number? Because people are probably interested how many species you've illustrated.
I don't know exactly how many species because I've done so many male, female, or different color variations, and maybe like 15 rainbow trout or different, red bands and Eagle Lake rainbow and Kamloops rainbow and that sort of thing. But I've done probably close to 1,400 illustrations, maybe.
Wow, that's incredible. Do you have a favorite? I mean, whether just because of how it turned out, or whether it was just a lot of fun to draw for some reason?
Yeah, there's some that boy I really like, and some that I'm not very fond of. Um, I would, I've got a pumpkin seed male that I really like, and some of the Mexican trout I'm pretty fond of because nobody's really illustrated them scientifically before. So the more obscure the fish, I don't mind doing it, even though there's no market for some of them. It's just they're all kind of like a piece of the puzzle of at least the freshwater. The saltwater's not the same way because there are so many saltwater fish and there are so many variations of like rockfish. You might have 10 different color forms of one species of rockfish, and to actually do all that scientifically is, it's more than I can do.
There's your life's work, just the rockfish.
Yeah, the Salish Sea project worked on with Ted Peach and Jay Orr at the University of Washington. That took about 15 years to complete.
Wow. Now, you mentioned that there are times when you're not able to get a specimen for whatever reason, whether it's an endangered species or, the gravid females, that sort of thing. Are there any species that you would consider kind of a unicorn, something that you've wanted to do but haven't had the opportunity yet?
Well, we know that there are more Mexican trout species than we've collected because they're at least that I haven't illustrated, and that other people like Mexican scientists have created. Because I've seen the preserved specimen. I'm like, this is from the same drainage, but it's not the same fish. And that's kind of exciting, but getting back to some of those areas is, it's problematic to get into those areas because anytime you go to Mexico, it's slow going, even with binky driving because the roads are so bad.
Bernie, are there any species, to throw this to you? So I feel like I'm just leaving you out, but are there any species that you mentioned the tri-spot, or I guess Joe mentioned the tri-spot earlier, that you kind of said you need to draw this? Are there any that you would love for Joe to tackle for whatever reason? Any species of fish that you'd love to see a scientific illustration of his?
He's done so many different species in the southeast. There's not a lot left to do. He's even tackled the Alabama cavefish, which is a white fish on a white background. So, I mean, that's about as hard as it gets. But I really don't have anything that like Joe has to do this until the next time I'm out and I get a fish that is amazing. And then, yeah, I'll change my tune. But at the moment, I can't think of anything.
How about one of those mountain red belly days?
Those are amazing, and even some of the laurel days that I get are just, yeah, but they're endangered, so I'm not going to preserve those for you. But
I've done that one.
you have, but I've found some that are just so amazing gold on the side, and the red
I
is
knew
so
it.
red.
I knew it.
Yeah, there's always one better hanging
I,
out there somewhere.
I've seen the same thing in the southern red belly days that I very rarely the specimen has a lot more gold on it, and it's just like, wow, I have to draw that.
Well, that is a species complex. There's several undescribed species within southern red belly dace.
Yeah, I figured.
How often do you find yourself feeling that sense that you wish you'd waited for that next specimen to show up, one that maybe has better color or better markings? Do you ever have that sense of like, oh, I missed my opportunity, I should have waited a week or two?
Well, probably because like the tri-spot darter example we use that Binky found, they'll show up and I've seen that sort of thing too with some very common fish like the common shiner, and like it's like, every time we'll go back and see one like, well, this one's even more colorful than the other. Is this the high, what you would call a high male? Is this as bright as they get? And occasionally you do run into that, but I don't regret it because generally, if we're out and we get 50 fish, 50 spawning something or other, well, they'll look mostly the same, and that's might be commonly what you see. And probably the best to do is the one that you see the most of.
The span of time that you've been doing this, at this point, decades, is obviously a long time in terms of technological advances. I mean, things are the acceleration of that advance is reaching the point where it feels like year to year capabilities of cameras and such improve dramatically. So, what role have some of those technological advances played, if any, in how you approach doing your work? Are you still more or less practicing it as you started, or have things informed your process technologically as those things have changed over time?
Well, when we started, we did to photograph in color. I worked from prints that would get the photographs developed, and I would generally take two cameras and shoot the fish with two cameras in case I lost some film or something happened with one of the rolls. And because if you go out to Wall Canyon, Nevada to get a sucker and you lose your film or your doesn't come out, you're not going to go back there once you get home. So that was how I started. But yeah, with it now, I mean, probably the last 15 years or 20 years now, maybe I've used digital cameras and occasionally just use my phone now. And I don't print them hardly at all, but I'll just use them. The color is better on my Mac than it would be in a print. But and a lot of times off the old prints, if the color's not quite right, if you've seen the fish, you'll know that red is not bright enough. And of course, then there's always the problem of when it's reproduced, is the color going to be accurate? And 100% accurate? No, not really. Although I will say the printers now, the Epson printers, that are made for artwork are fantastic. And they are so much better than the offset presses that we used to use back in the day. There's no comparison.
It also makes those prints pretty affordable. I was surprised when I looked at your website that you're offering these prints, I guess on a for per order basis. It looks like for what seemed like very reasonable prices.
Yeah, 25 years ago, you couldn't do that because if you wanted to print and you're going to use an offset press then, and if you're going to get on the offset press, you need to print 500 copies to make it cost effective. And who's going to sell 500 copies of a tri-spot darter? not me.
Bernie, you have a house. I mean, you could just paper the walls with it, I guess.
I'm pushing the limits with my spouse at the moment with all the fish stuff I've got. Let's not get me kicked out.
No, Melissa wants more.
Joe, we've talked a lot about the accuracy in your process and how important that is to the end use by scientists. And Bernie has trumpeted how beautiful this work is and how important that beauty is to the end use in terms of making the public care about these animals. What's more important to you, the accuracy or the beauty? Or is there beauty in the accuracy?
It's about 50-50, really. I can't, because if the beauty was more important, I mean, we just exaggerate the colors to sell the product. But um, there are certain being a scientist or having a background in science and knowing the lingo and that sort of thing has, even though my background's really not in ichthyology, and it's all seat of the pants basically, and learning the fish as I went, but knowing scientists and how to discriminate and know the scientific method. That I don't think I could do this job necessarily if I didn't have that background. And so the science of the illustration is sometimes, well, there are certain things in the fish that are diagnostic that might not show up in the photograph because of, I don't know, the angle or something. And all of those really need to be shown in a very subtle way sometimes because they're not obtrusive. That all those things need to be shown in the illustration, and that might just be like having little tubercles on some of the fins, or in a, for instance, a mad tom showing the little spines on the pectoral fin that might not be visible if when in another position of that fin, or in a photograph might not be visible, but when you look at the preserved specimen you can see that, and those kinds of things are diagnostic. So trying to show all of those and do it in an aesthetically pleasing way is my goal. And then when you publish a book like Fishes of Alabama or Trout and Salmon in North America or something, and you have all the pictures and they're all done the same way and they're all consistent. And this goes to what Binky was saying about, the photographs and how you can take all the photographs of fish and you can cut them out and you can get some good ones. I mean, let's say these people, the photography is excellent nowadays, but getting them to look all the same and have it a layout that's aesthetically pleasing is a lot easier with the scientific illustrations.
All right, as we start to wind down this conversation, which has gone on for near on an hour, but this is just such a fascinating topic to me. I love to think about this intersection of these two worlds that I think people might consider to be almost at odds with each other, the artistic and the scientific. And I think scientific illustration is so fascinating just because of how clearly they overlap and complement each other. So if someone were wanting to follow in your footsteps, and then the next generation of scientific illustrators, somebody maybe who's listening to this, who feels inspired to follow in your role or a role like yours, what advice would you give to them? What skills should they be improving on? How can they approach making a living at it?
Well, I think some science biology classes would definitely help if you're going to be a scientific illustrator. And one of the things that helped me was going to scientific meetings. And generally, the scientific meetings will have a room where people are displaying products that they sell to the scientific community. And I would set up with artwork and sell prints. That was how I got work doing working on the various state fish books projects. That's a big help. And then picking your medium and probably staying away from birds because there's so many people that do birds so well. I mean, I've done a couple, but I'm like, you know, there's a lot of competition. I don't know that you could make a living doing birds. So if you're going to do birds, you better just love art and love what you do and not necessarily plan on making a living at that. But, there are a lot of other, like, I was just telling Binky earlier that some people that in Canada wanted some mussel illustrations, and then there's people that would want crayfish, perhaps, and then turtles. I see those on occasion, and sometimes to get a contract, I had to do some of those. I'm like, I don't want to do these. Can't we substitute some? No, you have to do these crayfish.
We talked a little bit about that ongoing Mexican trout project, but what else are you working on right now, and how can people learn more about the work that you have done?
Well, I just got a couple specimens from the Royal Ontario Museum to do that they need, and I didn't collect these. They sent them to me, and we're sending some pictures of those fish live that they collected. And it's not very cost effective to go to Canada especially under the current conditions, to go to Canada to get two fish. Well, aside from Colin Binky, who's obviously my best promoter, they could go to my website, which is americanfishes.com.
With that, I think we can go ahead and wrap up this conversation. But thanks to you, Joe, for making time in your schedule and joining us remotely for this conversation. And obviously, Bernie, you are also remote, though much closer to me here at the aquarium from your office out there at the Conservation Institute. But thank you to both of you for taking the time to be on the podcast Aquatic and giving some insights into the how and why of scientific illustration.
And if you want to find out how Binky got us lost in Mexico, we have a YouTube video called Truchas Mexicanas.
Yes, we do. So you can learn about how Joe didn't follow rules.
Tell the truth, Binky.
Tell the truth, Joe.
If you have an idea for a future episode of the podcast Aquatic, whether that's a full-length episode like you've just been listening to, or a shorter form topic that we call a mic droplet, something that we could handle in 10 minutes or less, send that to me at podcast@tnaqua.org. And while you're online, go ahead and leave us a rating or write us a review on your podcast platform of choice. They are free and easy ways to support the show and improve our reach with the algorithm, which lets more people hear discussions like we just had with Joe and Bernie. In the meantime, until next time, remember that every drop matters.